Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kat, so much for the invitation to be here.
Wonderful. I always love an opportunity to hang out with you. So, your work is all around ethnicity pay gap reporting and helping organizations to navigate that. So, let's start with a quick introduction to you first.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Michelle Gyimah and I run a pay gaps consultancy called Equality Pays. Primarily what we do is we work with organizations to help make sense of the pay gap data that they have so that they can focus on the right metrics and focus on making the right impact and not getting too bogged down or too stressed out about numbers that they think make them look bad. So we help with the strategy and the communication plans, and we can also support with implementation for wherever any training is needed.
Brilliant. Let's start with the very basics then. So, I encounter a lot of people who don't actually know what the ethnicity pay gap is. Let's expand on that then. What is the ethnicity pay gap or your organization's ethnicity pay gap?
Yeah. So when we talk about pay gaps, I think it's quite easy to kind of get confused because a lot of people confuse it with equal pay. So they think it's about a man and a woman being paid exactly the same for doing the same job, or, somebody who's white and somebody's black and they're being paid for doing exactly the same job. And it's not that. What the pay gap looks at is the average earnings between two sets of people. So you would take your organization and let's just say, for example, you did like a really rough and ready pay gap kind of analysis and you had everybody who was white and everybody who wasn't. And I wouldn't advise doing this because it's not the most accurate way to do it. But for this example, I'll use this. And you took their average earnings, that would give you what the pay gap is. And so in gender, we have two calculations. So you have the mean pay gap and you have the median. So the median is where you have everybody's pay, and then you basically take what is in the middle. And then the mean is where you add everybody's pay and you divide it by the number of people, and that will give you the pay gap number. So in short, it's basically about the average earnings of one group of people in the organization compared to another. In that example, I did say about having your kind of white employees and then all of your employees are not white. We don't actually recommend that because, as you know, when it comes to minoritized people, we're not a monolith. And obviously, people experience their pay gap in different ways, and that could be related to the ethnic group that they're in. So, we actually advise that you have some form of categorization so that you don't just have, two comparators, everybody who's white and then everybody else who, is from a black or Asian background.
Yes. So you would advise calculating it based on ethnic group then?
Yeah, and the jury is still out in terms of how you do that. And I think actually the government did put out some advice. So I think there is something in their guidance around the different ways in which you can do that. You can also look at the ONS website to see how they do their calculations, or some organizations might decide to go with what's in the census. So there are different ways of doing it, but like I said, the example of doing everybody white and then everybody who isn't white is the one that will not give you any useful information. So don't do that.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant. So let's talk about why it's important then. So I meet a lot of organizations of fewer than 250 people who aren't even doing their gender pay gap reporting. So why is it important, even though you don't have to, still to do your pay gap reporting?
Well, it's important because it's happening within the organization. So just because you don't have to report on it doesn't mean that you don't have those issues and you don't have those problems. And so I think, as an organization, it makes sense for you to have as much data as you can about what is happening. The decisions that you make in, all sorts of other aspects of your organization is often based on data. So it doesn't make sense to make a decision of saying, right, we're not going to do anything about the problems that we have because the government says that we don't have to. I mean, there are organizations that are smaller than 250 that do report, and my prediction is that they will be saving themselves from so many future problems because they're addressing them here and now while they're small. it's much more difficult, not impossible, but it is more difficult to make the necessary changes that you need to when you're a bigger organization. So if you're a smaller one and you're thinking, well, we don't need to do this work, so we're going to park it until we get big enough and we have to, what I would say is that you need to think about what is the cost to the organization now, because there is a cost to not doing this work. And then ask yourself, is it worth paying that cost, or would it not be better investment of your time and your money, etc., to understand what's happening so you can fix those problems now before you grow and get bigger and they become much more embedded within the organization.
Perfect. That's just such a perfect explanation. Actually, it makes like that must be so motivating for people to be like, yeah, of course, of course we're just going to do it now. I think a lot of people are held back by fear. They're held back by two things, I think, and please let me know what you have experienced when you've actually been doing this. But I feel like they're held back by fear of, gosh, what's the number going to be and what we're going to have to do off the back of this. And secondly, a lot of organizations will say to me, well, we've got such a small number of racially marginalized employees or ethnically marginalized employees. Do we need to do it? If you have 3 or 4 or 13 out of, 200,
Mm.
do you recommend that people still do that?
Yeah, and the fear is definitely real. I mean, I know of organizations who will actually crunch the numbers, but they don't publish it internally amongst, a large number of people, and definitely not externally. And it's because the numbers, are not telling a pretty story, and they know that if they share that information, there's going to be an expectation, quite rightly, that they do work around this. And so that fear is definitely there. However, my take on that is that, but once you know that information, you can't unknow it. And again, not doing anything about it doesn't mean that the problem isn't there, because it's having an impact in your organization. So it's having an impact on, your recruitment, your retention, your promotion, your brand reputation. It's already there. So being fearful of the numbers, I totally understand that, but the numbers are there to help you. You need to be looking at it as a gift, as a way for you to better understand what's happening within your organization, and ask yourself some honest questions of, okay, so we have this data. The numbers on the face of it don't look great, but what is it genuinely telling us about our organization? Are there things that we genuinely need to do? Are there things that are outside of our control? And what are the things that we can control for so that we can make improvements? So I think for me, it's about using those numbers in a way that is positive, because it's giving you insight into issues as opposed to being scared of them and therefore just suppressing them and not talking about them because currently you don't have to. I mean, at the time of recording, we still have a Tory government. By the time this goes out, we might have a Labour government, and they have committed to public mandatory reporting on the grounds of ethnicity and disability as well. So if you are in that space where you're fearful about your numbers either because you don't have them and you don't know what they're going to look like, or you do have them and they don't look great, the time is going to come where you're going to have to go public with that. So now is the best time to start preparing yourself in terms of the actions that you're going to take and your comms in terms of how you're going to talk about it, because this information is going to be out there for the public to see if Labour get in.
Yes, brilliant point. And on the point about the smaller groups, because of the way that it's calculated, because of the maths, it doesn't matter if you've got one or you've got 50,000 of a particular group. It's because it's based on the hourly pay. It doesn't matter how small that group is, you can still do it. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, because that comes up quite a lot, like how do you protect people's, anonymity, especially when there's small groups? And I think there are ways in which you collect the data, but how you report on that data really is up to you. So if you know that if you report it in this specific way, it's going to identify people very specifically, you can choose to report it externally or sort of internally within the organization, wider organization, in a way that protects that anonymity, but you have the raw data on which you can base what your actions are going to be next. And quite often what we see um, when we kind of look at DEI work, the types of initiatives, the types of work that is done often is beneficial to everybody. So then there's an issue around, well, how do we educate people and how do we talk about what we're doing in a way so that everybody can see how it benefits them as well, even if they don't fall under that particular protected characteristic group. Like, for example, I remember I was talking to an organization and they had asked for ethnicity data and they were really surprised because what they found was a lot of the white colleagues were not filling it out, were not providing it. And when they asked questions and delved into it, they were saying, well, this isn't for us. And we know it's not for us. This is to do with, people who are Black or Asian. So there's no point in us filling this out because we're not going to benefit in any way. And so that was enlightening for them that they had to do some work around, how they were communicating this, what was the purpose of this, and ensuring that people understood that whilst we might be focusing on our protected characteristic, the benefits of doing this isn't just for that group. There's a ripple effect that's going to be good for everybody. That's another thing that needs to be kind of discussed more and planned for as well for organizations to get that engagement and buy-in so that they can get, good, robust data so that they can put initiatives in place.
Yeah, we talk about this all day long because we are in the business of gathering EDI data. And if there's one thing that I bang on about all the time, it's don't launch with a narrative that is something like diversity is very important to us, because the majority of your organization don't understand what diversity is. And they don't understand that they themselves are different to their colleagues who may on the outside look like them. They're thinking, you mean people of color and you mean women, and that's not for me. So what is likely the majority of your organization are probably not going to engage with anything that they haven't first been foundationally educated about. What does this actually mean for me and what's in it for me? How do you help organizations to do that? Do you get involved in that side?
Yeah, and it's funny actually because that is the piece that organizations don't think about. So when I'm having conversations, it's always about the data collection, which is challenging for some organizations, especially those who've either never collected any ethnicity data before, disability data before, or they've done it sporadically and the return rates are not great. So obviously there's some really practical things that you need to do. But when I start talking about the culture piece and education and communication, I can see like puzzled looks on their faces. And I'll say, so for example, if you have had a history of a specific department or team or manager who maybe has been problematic in the past, and say an incident has happened and, somebody, say, for example, like a Black woman, and she was fired and it caused a lot of, trauma within the workplace. Let's just say that that's happened and that happened 2 or 3 years ago. And then you're now coming forward and saying, we need to do ethnicity pay gap reporting and we would like you to share your data. Have you thought about the impact that that incident those years ago had on everybody? Have you thought about the lingering impact that has? And how has that been addressed? And you can start to see light bulbs going off because, we know statistically, I was part of a report that with the Fawcett Society and Runnymede Trust, talking about the experiences of women of colour within UK workplaces. So we know that there are issues of people being held back, people being facing, grievances, disciplinaries, not having access to, opportunities to progress in the workplace. So we know that those things happen. But what organizations are not kind of connecting the dots on is the impact that has on people and the fact that this will be remembered when you put out your survey asking for this information. And so that is one of the things that we help organizations with. We help them to, really take a good look at, what their behaviors have been over the last few years and help them to acknowledge and understand the impact that has had and support them with, well, what's the comms going to be around this? How are you going to address people's fears, and beliefs around this? If trust has been eroded, how are you going to build that trust? Because without those foundational things, you can ask for this information every day of the week for the next 3 years. You won't get anything. And you'll always be sat there going, we haven't got enough data. But you have to acknowledge that. And especially, again, if we have a Labour government, they're going to be making this reporting mandatory. But your employees, they don't have to give you this information if they don't want it. So you're going to be this sticky place where you've got this mandatory requirement based on voluntary data. And so you have to build that bridge. You have to understand, well, what is the bridge between the two? And how do we overcome it? And so that is part of the work that we do with organizations to help them understand what is happening or has happened in their culture that means that they're not getting the returns that they're looking for, and how do we spend time fixing that?
Yeah, totally. As I say, we see that all the time. And you're right, people don't, because they can only see it through their own lens a lot of the time. And they're going, well, I would put my data in the HR system because I want to be part of the pay gap reporting thing. But actually, that's not going to work for, for everybody else. And they're so surprised when they get like, we've only had 27% response rate. I can't believe it. And you're like, I can believe it. Why would they? There's so much fear and so much suspicion from people, like, why are you asking me for this? What are you going to do with it? And how might this hurt me? They're not thinking, how would this benefit me? Because a lot of the time, they haven't taken the time to go, this is going to be beneficial for everyone. And here's why. They're just like, well, we need to do this. So you need to comply. And they're like, well, no, I won't.
I
Because
don't have to.
yeah, exactly. And it's like, I've got power here and I'm going to use that power to protect myself. Honestly, I think a lot of the time it's due to the fear of, if I fear and suspicion around, if I give you this, what are you going to do with it? And how might it come back at me badly? So
Exactly.
yeah,
And
so
that fear and suspicion, it's not come out of nowhere. It will have come from either their own personal lived experiences or seeing their colleagues going through things in the workplace. So, none of those fears are unfounded. And so it really is, it's important to give it the importance that it's due, because it's going to be one of a few or many stumbling blocks to you being able to gather the amount of data that makes you feel safe enough to be able to say, okay, here's where the intervention is. And so I would say to organizations, even low return rates tells a story. So you can't be relying on the fact that, oh, the return rates are low, so we can't do anything. It's like, no, why are the return rates low? There's a loaded question for you, and the answers are there, but you have to be willing to ask it.
that's probably one of the most important and telling pieces of data, actually, is your return rate, because it says so much about the psychological safety, the culture, all sorts of things, doesn't it? Tell you what, I do love a bit of data, Michelle. So let's talk about something that happened to me the other day. So we run a leadership alignment session, and I had a room full of people who said that they had a 0% ethnicity pay gap at leadership level. So that's one of the questions we ask. Are you working on closing your ethnicity pay gap at leadership level? And they said, we don't have one because we don't have any racially marginalized people at leadership level.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, right? It almost feels like this person was just basically trying to find a way to say, next, moving on. Nothing to see here. But again, absence tells you something that I don't know where this organization is based as well, because that's another thing to think about. Is this organization based in an area where there's literally everybody is white? What is the demographics of, where this organization is set? And it really does feel like a way to just say, well, we don't have to do this because we don't have any. For me, that's really telling, because then I would be like, well, why is that? Because, that's a genuine question that you can ask. And if there's no response, showcases that this has been thought about and they've put effort into how they recruit and how they promote and retain people, through an ethnicity lens, then again, that is information that you can use. So even just the issue of saying, oh, we don't have anybody, that's not a problem, that doesn't work. I mean, we've seen this with gender pay gap reporting. So many organizations, so many sectors have, 0 or very, very few women within the upper quartiles, but that doesn't mean that they don't have a gender pay gap problem. They do. And it's there saying women get to this point and then they either thin out or they disappear at this point. And it's exactly the same with, the the example that you've just given, the absence of people from a specific protected characteristic group doesn't mean the absence of them. If
Yeah.
anything, it's like more telling. It's the other way around.
Yeah.
And and sometimes you can answer, there can be genuine answers, but I find that quite often organizations don't have genuine answers because they haven't thought of this as an issue that needs to be addressed. It's just been a case of, well, this is how it's always been, so we don't think that there's a problem.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So let's talk about positive outcomes then. So what sort of great results have you seen from organizations who have calculated their ethnicity pay gap specifically?
Yeah, so I mean, this one is a bit of a tricky one because we have seen, I think since 2020, we have seen less and less organizations publicly reporting on their ethnicity pay gap. So it's a bit of a difficult one to be able to answer properly. But what I have seen from organizations that have been doing this work most likely internally because they're not ready to kind of publish the data, there's been a real focus and drive in terms of how they present themselves to the outside world from a recruitment perspective. So it may not be that they have seen, great drops in their numbers in your pay gap, because as you know, the pay gap figure itself is very volatile and, is subject to all sorts of change. But I think the biggest wins will be around attitude and awareness that maybe the way in which an organization has been doing things around recruitment and promotion, there's been a shift and a change, and asking themselves much more questions of, well, why do we do recruitment this way? And if we continue to do it this way, are we unintentionally excluding people that traditionally would never look at us as an organization? So we're starting to see more and more organizations think outside the box in terms of how they do their recruitment and their marketing, but also the kind of career progression piece and thinking before making those decisions and thinking, okay, well, what would the impact be? How would the impact be different for colleagues who are from ethnic minority groups if we undertook, this specific way of doing something? So I think in terms of numbers, we're not going to see those drastic drops, and it's the same with pay gaps as well. But it's more about that slow behavior change and analysis and questioning. Okay, if we do it this way, what are the unintended consequences?
Yes, it's about, I always say the same thing. You're not going to whack-a-mole these things shut overnight and actually get that into your narrative straight away and talk about it often, because it's about sustainable marginal gains, isn't it? It's about that. It's not about those tactical behaviors. I've seen so many organizations go, even at the very beginning, 2018, when it was gender pay gap reporting one, everyone was panic stations, trying to stuff women to their boards left, right, and center. An organization that I knew of put 8 women onto the board overnight, and they had a board of 16 people, which was completely paralyzed. They could not make a decision. They could not even all get in a meeting room at the same time together. The reputational damage they did themselves was enormous. And also the damage they did to those women who they pushed onto the board. Everyone was not respectful of their positions, their new positions, because they were like, we know why you're there. And the women themselves were like, this is just awful. This is not how I wanted this to happen. And it was just an absolute catastrophe. They ended up, because that was such an unwieldy size of decision-making body, they ended up having like a decision-making board, which was the original 8 men. So,
oh, interesting.
Oh my gosh, dreadful, dreadful times. So what would you recommend then for organizations who want to take their very first steps into ethnicity pay gap reporting? What would you recommend that they start to do?
Yeah, so my recommendation is that they would need to assess where they are on this journey, because organizations are going to be at different points. So if you have never collected this data before, then obviously you're going to be right at the starting point. So you'll have to think about the practical aspects in terms of the very simple. How are we going to do it? How are we going to ask for this data? Where is it going to be housed? Who's going to be responsible? All of those really practical things. But then also looking at the culture piece, because if you've never asked for it before and then you're suddenly asking for it, that's a big leap. So there has to be some level of, education and repeated communication about how this is going to work, what the purpose is, and, answering people's questions and addressing people's fears as well. So that's for somebody who's never done anything. For those organizations that maybe have been very, very sporadic in how they've asked for the data and information, for you, it's going to be about tightening up that process and thinking about all the different touch points where you can ask for this data. So not just relying on new recruits. I see this a lot. Oh, we asked new recruits about their data. It's like, well, yes, but what about everybody that already works there as well? You need their information. And again, that culture piece, if you've asked for it once or twice, and you're now going to be talking about this consistently, how do you prepare people? How do you build up that engagement? And again, if you have a history of issues to do with like bullying, harassment, discrimination in the past, those things need to be addressed. And for other organizations that maybe have that data and they haven't published it wider internally, it's going to be around the comms. It's going to be a real focus on helping people understand what the data is saying versus what it doesn't, what actions you're going to be putting in place, and also be very open around accountability and expectations. And I think this probably goes for everybody in terms of, managing people's expectations about what is possible. And this isn't to say to kind of like dampen enthusiasm or ambition, but we see this with gender pay gap reporting, that there is this feeling of it's not moving fast enough. It's taking too long. You see all these reports. It's going to take 150 years to close the gender pay gap, all that type of stuff. But we do have to be pragmatic about what is possible because, as you said before, the thing that's most important is that it's sustainable, that it's the right actions and that they are sustainable over having quick wins so that 1 year your pay gap looks great. And it's so it really is going to have to do quite a bit of work around focusing on that managing expectation, but also being open around what is working, what isn't working, why you're making this choice over another choice, all to build that trust, all to build that engagement. So really it's about understanding where you are on that spectrum and what the next step looks like and what it is that you need to achieve to go to that next step.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michelle. You're an absolute goldmine of information on this topic. You are such an expert. I absolutely love your posts on LinkedIn as well. And I really love your newsletter. So tell everybody then, if they have had their interest piqued and they would love to chat to you about the work that you do, how can people get in touch with you?
Yeah, so there are two ways. So the first is I have a podcast of my own. It's called Beyond the Pay Gap Figure. And so there I share kind of behind the scenes information as to what organizations are doing, what their struggles are, what the obstacles are, and how they're kind of overcoming them. So do subscribe to that and take a listen. If you want to get in touch, like you said, the best place to find me is on LinkedIn under my name, Michelle Gyimah. And, I'd be more than happy to engage with you. Or if you want to have a private conversation, you can just pop me a DM and we can have a private chat to see how I can support you.
Amazing. Thank you so much for being here.
No problem. Thanks so much for having me.